By the spring of 1945, German tank crews in Berlin had a name for the thing they feared most in the broken streets. They did not call it a tank. They called it the Beast Killer. In Russian, the word was Zveroboy, and the men who whispered it had watched it do something that should not have been possible. They had watched a single high-explosive shell lift a 60-ton Tiger off its tracks and leave it burning in the rubble, its crew dead inside armor that had never been cleanly pierced. This is the story of the Soviet ISU-152, the heavy assault gun the Red Army drove straight into the heart of Hitler's capital. And it is the story of the prestige Waffen-SS division that tried to stop it, the 11th SS Panzergrenadier division, Nordland, in the last 12 days of the war, from the 21st of April to the 2nd of May 1945. What happened in those streets was not a fair fight. It was a demolition. To understand why German soldiers feared this machine so much, you have to understand what the Red Army actually built. And you have to understand the problem the Soviets were trying to solve when they built it. By 1943, the Red Army had a gap in its arsenal. Soviet tank corps could break through German lines, but when they hit a hardened strongpoint, a concrete bunker, a fortified house, an anti-tank gun dug into rubble, the tanks would stall. Towed heavy artillery had the punch to crack those positions, but it took time to unlimber, time to set up, time to register the guns under fire, and in a breakthrough, time was the one thing nobody had. The older KV-2 had tried to fill this role years earlier, but it was a pre-war relic. Too tall, too slow, too few of them ever made. What the Red Army needed was a weapon that could arrive with the assault, hit first, and keep moving. Something armoured enough to survive the counterfire, and heavy enough that one shell could end an argument. The first answer came before the ISU-152 ever existed. In the summer of 1943, the Soviets fielded an earlier machine called the Su-152, built on the older KV heavy tank hull. It carried the same monstrous gun the later vehicle would use, and it went into action at the Battle of Kursk, in the fighting near Prokhorovka and the Orel salient in July of 1943. Soviet crews used it at point-blank range against the German armoured spearheads, against Tigers and Panthers and assault guns, and they found that the huge shell did not need to behave like a normal tank gun. It functioned like a demolition hammer. The crews credited it with smashing dug-in strongpoints and knocking out the heaviest German tanks at short range. And it was at Kursk, hunting what Soviet gunners called the fascist beasts, that the nickname was born. Zveroboy, the Beast Killer. The name would follow the gun for the rest of the war and pass on to its successor. That successor was the machine that would finish the job in Berlin. The Red Army's heavy tank design chief, a man named Joseph Kotin, went to work on something better than the Su-152. The lead designer on the new vehicle's chassis and layout was an engineer named G.N. Moskvin. Their idea was brutally simple. Take the hull of the new IS heavy tank, the same chassis that carried the famous IS-2. Build a low, thick, armoured box on top of it, and inside that box mount one of the heaviest guns the Soviets had, the 152mm ML-20S gun howitzer. Development began in July of 1943. By December, the new machine was rolling off the floor of the Chelyabinsk-Kirov plant, the sprawling factory complex in the Ural Mountains that Soviet workers had nicknamed Tankograd, Tank City. This was no ordinary factory. It was the evacuated heart of Soviet heavy industry. Machine tools and skilled workers hauled east out of the path of the German advance and reassembled in the Urals under wartime pressure. Tankograd did not just build tanks. It turned out the heaviest siege weapons the Red Army owned, and it did it while fighting constant shortages of steel, optics, and skilled labor. Building the ISU-152 was harder than building a tank. The vehicle was huge, and the fixed armored casemate had to be machined to take the enormous recoil of the gun. The gun mount and the recoil gear were their own industrial bottleneck, a separate problem from the hull, and the two had to be married together and proof-fired on the line. Every vehicle competed for the same steel and the same machining capacity as the IS-2 tank program running alongside it. Between December of 1943 and the end of the war in Europe, that factory turned out 1,885 of them. At the peak, in March of 1944, around 170 rolled out in a single month. This was the ISU-152. And on paper it was almost crude. The thing that made it so dangerous was also the thing that made it look primitive. The gun could only swing a few degrees left or right. There was no turret. To aim, the whole 46-ton machine had to be steered onto the target with its tracks, like pointing a battering ram. The rate of fire was painfully slow, 2 to 3 rounds a minute, and there was a hard reason for that. The ML-20S used separate loading ammunition. The shell and the propellant charge were two different pieces, and both were enormous. The crew had to manhandle the projectile into the breech first, then ram home the charge behind it, then lock the breech, all by hand, in a cramped iron compartment that filled with smoke and fumes after every shot. A vehicle that carried only about 20 rounds could empty itself fast, and reloading the ammunition racks under fire was its own ordeal. But none of that mattered when you saw what one round could do. The main shell, the OF-540 high-explosive round, weighed 96 pounds and carried 13 pounds of TNT packed inside. The armor-piercing round, the BR-540, weighed 107 pounds and left the barrel at nearly 2,000 feet per second. At close range, that armor-piercing shell could punch through about 5 inches of steel. And against the kind of fortifications the Soviets meant to destroy, walls, bunkers, barricaded houses, the high-explosive round did not need to punch through anything at all. It just collapsed the building on top of whoever was inside. The crews learned a hard truth in combat that the engineers had only hoped for. The ISU-152 did not have to score a clean hit to kill a German heavy tank. This is the part that most people get wrong about the weapon. They imagine it punching neat holes through armor like an anti-tank gun. That is not how it worked. A near miss with that 96-pound shell could shatter welds, blow off tracks, jam a turret solid, rip open an engine deck, and concuss the crew into uselessness. If the shell struck the armor at an angle, or even detonated just short of contact, the shock wave alone could crack the welds, shear the bolts, and spray lethal steel splinters off the inside face of the plate into the men behind it. The plate did not have to be holed, the shock did the work. German and Soviet accounts both describe Panthers and Tigers being disabled by 152mm hits that never cleanly perforated anything. Tanks left with their turrets jammed, their tracks gone, their crews stunned senseless inside intact armor. That is how a gun howitzer earned a nickname meant for hunters. The Tiger I, the Tiger II, the Panther, Even the rare elephant and Jagdtiger, all of them were the beasts. And this was the thing that killed them. Before Berlin, the gun got one more great rehearsal in city fighting, and it is worth pausing on because it shows exactly what was coming. In April of 1945, the Red Army stormed the East Prussian fortress city of Königsberg. From the 6th to the 9th of April, Soviet assault groups fought their way through a layered defensive system of concrete forts, anti-tank ditches, barricades, and reinforced buildings, held by the German garrison under General Otto Lasch. And right there in the thick of it were the heavy assault guns. ISU-152 batteries pushed forward into the street fighting zone to blast strongpoints at short range. Soviet accounts describe them firing directly at German firing points from roughly 100 to 400 yards, sometimes closer, when rubble and smoke and narrow streets forced the guns into line-of-sight work. They were not sniper tanks. They were breaching hammers, credited with destroying pillboxes, casemates, machine gun nests, and barricaded houses one after another. General Lasch surrendered the fortress that should have held for months. Königsberg was the clearest proof, outside Berlin itself, of what these guns did to a city. And the lesson was simple. Concrete that was supposed to be impregnable came apart under direct 152mm fire. But a weapon is only as good as the moment it is tested, and the test that mattered most was waiting in Berlin. By the 21st of April 1945, the Red Army had reached the eastern edge of the German capital. The city was a corpse that did not yet know it was dead, and waiting inside it was one of the toughest formations the Waffen-SS had left. The 11th SS Panzergrenadier Division Nordland was not an ordinary German unit. It had been formed in 1943, built up out of the old SS Nordic Legion and a corps of veteran cadres, and then filled out with foreign volunteers, men from Denmark, Norway and other occupied countries who had thrown in with the German cause. These were Freiwilligen, foreign recruits fighting under the SS banner, and by the time the division reached Berlin, its ranks were a mix of battered Eastern Front veterans and those foreign volunteers. By April of 1945, the division was a shadow of its old strength, but it carried a reputation that made Soviet crews cautious. Nordland's reputation was never really about battlefield glory. It was about fanatical endurance. It did not break when an ordinary unit would have broken. It kept fighting after losses that should have ended it. Soviet assault gun crews expected exactly that. A division that would keep fighting from the cellars long after a normal garrison had given up. On the 25th of April, command of Berlin's Defense Sector C went to an SS Brigadeführer named Gustav Krukenberg, after the larger command structure under Felix Steiner had collapsed. Krukenberg's headquarters was not a bunker or a fortress. It was a railway carriage parked in the Stadtmitte underground station, a U-Bahn stop deep beneath the dying city. From that carriage, in the dark of the subway tunnels, Krukenberg ran the defense of the government quarter, the last ring around Hitler's bunker. And Nordland still had teeth. Attached to the division was a heavy tank battalion, the Hermann von Salza, fielding some of the most feared armour the Germans ever built, the Tiger II, the King Tiger. 68 tons of steel with an 88mm gun that could kill almost anything on the battlefield from a mile away. Alongside it, Nordland's defenders fought with whatever was leftover Panzer IVs and Panthers, assault guns, half-tracks, self-propelled flak guns, and anti-tank guns dug into the rubble. They were no longer a manoeuvre force. They had become a set of local fire brigades, plugging defensive knots around the intersections and canals of the central city. In an open field, that King Tiger was a nightmare for any Soviet crew, but Berlin was not an open field. Berlin was a rubble maze of collapsed masonry, cratered boulevards, broken tram lines, and smoke so thick you could not see across a single street. Late April brought cold, damp, overcast weather that pressed the smoke down into the ruins and shortened every line of sight. And in that maze, the 88mm gun's great advantage, its range, meant nothing. Everything happened at 100 yards or less. sometimes much less. This was exactly the ground the ISU-152 was built to win. Now, if you are getting something out of this story, take 1 second to subscribe to the channel. We dig into the weapons and the men of the Eastern Front every week, and we go deeper than the usual highlight reels. The Soviet assault groups that pushed into Berlin did not fight the way you might imagine. They did not roll their tanks down the middle of the street and hope. They had learned, block by bloody block, from Stalingrad through Königsberg to this final city, that urban combat demanded a different method. The lesson had been written in blood, and the answer was the assault group. Each assault group was a small, mixed team. Riflemen, combat engineers, the sappers, carrying demolition charges, and the heavy hammer of the group, an ISU-152 or 2, moving up behind the infantry. The order of work was almost a ritual. The riflemen went first, clearing windows and cellars, hunting the Panzerfaust teams that could turn any doorway into a death trap. The engineers blew the obstacles and the barricades the infantry could not pass. And when the assault group hit something they could not crack, a barricaded house, a strongpoint, a German tank dug in at the end of a street, they called the beast killer forward. Then the ISU-152 would do the one thing it did better than any vehicle on Earth. It would crawl into line of sight, point its whole hull at the target, and fire one shell. Because the gun could barely traverse, the driver was as much a part of aiming as the gunner. The commander would talk the driver onto the target, nudging the 46-ton hull a few degrees at a time, while the gunner laid the sight. The crews used a telescopic sight called the ST-10, marked out for direct fire, and at these ranges they could hardly miss. They pre-sighted their guns on the street junctions ahead of them, picked out range markers on the buildings, and waited. When the shot came, it came fast and it came final. The effect was apocalyptic. A barricade that had held up an entire battalion would vanish in a cloud of brick dust and bodies. The upper floors of a house full of snipers would simply slide into the street. A machine gun nest that had pinned the riflemen for an hour would cease to exist. The crews learned to fire into the apertures themselves, through a window, into an embrasure, smashing the firing point and then collapsing the masonry above it for good measure. The German defenders had a word for what this felt like. They said the strongpoints, the things that were supposed to make them safe, had become coffins. Every intersection the Soviets reached, every fortified building, could be erased by a single round from a machine they often never even saw coming through the smoke. Nordland fought back the only way it could. On the 26th of April, the division threw a counterattack into the district of Neukölln, in the southeast of the city, near the Sonnenallee. The Tiger IIs of the Hermann von Salza battalion led the push. For a moment, the old SS reputation flickered back to life. As Nordland and a force of attached defenders, including French SS volunteers and Hitler Youth, fell back toward the square called Hermannplatz, they fought with a desperate ferocity, and they claimed 14 Soviet tanks, knocked out with Panzerfausts in that withdrawal alone. It was not nothing, but it was not enough, and it could not last. Because for every position Nordland held, the Red Army brought up the one weapon that did not care how brave the defenders were. Here is what the Soviet crews understood that the SS did not want to admit. Courage does not stop a 107-pound shell. A King Tiger could be the finest tank in the world, and it still could not survive a direct-fire ISU-152 round through its side at 100 yards. The thick frontal armour that made the Tiger II nearly invincible in a long-range duel meant nothing when a Soviet gun crew waited in a side street, let the German tank rumble past, and fired into its flank from behind a pile of rubble. The whole logic of the King Tiger, its long reach, its impenetrable front, was a logic for open ground. In Berlin, the range bands that protected it had been erased. The fight happened at the one distance where the German advantage disappeared and the Soviet shell became unanswerable. That was the whole game in Berlin. The Soviet crews did not try to outduel the Germans gun to gun. They used the city. They pre-sighted their guns on street junctions and waited. They fired from concealed corners and backed away before the German gunners could answer, a method the crews drilled into a rhythm. Advance, halt, fire, shift, then do it again from a new position before the enemy could find them. When a tiger exposed its side, they took it, and when a strongpoint refused to fall, they levelled the building it stood in. The ISU-152 was not invincible, far from it. In the close confines of Berlin, a German Panzerfaust team that got onto a roof or into the rubble behind the machine could kill it from above or from the rear, where the armour was thin. The vehicle was nearly blind in close combat, with limited vision out of the sealed casemate, and a soldier who got close enough could end it. Soviet crews lost vehicles this way. That is exactly why they never sent the assault guns in alone. The rifleman and the beast killer kept each other alive. The infantry guarded the heavy gun from the Panzerfaust ambushes, walking close alongside the hull, watching the windows and rooftops the crew could not see. The heavy guns smashed open everything the infantry could not. Together, they were almost unstoppable. And step by step, the two armies ground toward the centre. By the 27th of April, the situation for Nordland had gone from desperate to hopeless. The remnants of the division were pushed back into the central government district, the Citadel sector, the last few blocks around the Reich Chancellery and the bunker where Hitler still hid. Krukenberg's men were no longer a manoeuvring force. They were a collection of survivor groups fighting from cellar to cellar, the foreign volunteers and the SS veterans and the Hitler Youth all pressed into the same shrinking pocket. That same day, the Soviet 8th Guards Army under General Vasily Chuikov forced its way across the Landwehr Canal, the last major water barrier before the government quarter. Chuikov knew this kind of fighting better than almost any commander alive. He was the man who had held Stalingrad, and he understood the close, vicious arithmetic of a city battle. Some of his men swam the canal, others crawled through the sewers to outflank the defenders, and behind them came the heavy assault guns, hauling themselves over rubble and broken bridges toward the Tiergarten, the great central park that had become a battlefield. In the Tiergarten, the last tiger tanks of the Hermann von Salza battalion made their stand among the shattered trees, trying to hold the road to the Reichstag. It was the kind of prestige armour that had terrified the Allies for years, and here, in the smoke of the dying capital, it was being hunted down at point-blank range by Soviet crews who had learned every trick the city could teach. The great trees of the park were splintered stumps, the paths were cratered, and through the smoke the assault guns crawled forward, looking for the flank shot that would finish the last of the King Tigers. The math by now was simple and merciless. Nordland's confidence had been built on the idea that a fortified position, held by hard men with good armour, could stop anything. The ISU-152 took that idea apart, one collapsed building at a time. The Soviet method, advance, halt, fire, shift, then do it again, did not just destroy the German hardpoints, it destroyed the belief that hardpoints could save anyone. Every coffin corner the Red Army erased made the next one easier. The division's combat effectiveness was being ground down, not in one great duel, but in 100 small erasures, each strongpoint blown apart, each tank flanked and gutted, until what had been a combined arms division was nothing but fragments. By the 30th of April, the Red Army was inside the Reichstag itself. The fighting went room to room, floor to floor, with German troops counter-attacking out of the basement. Above the building, a red flag went up that would become one of the most famous images of the entire war. And in the streets all around it, the beast killers kept working. There was no grand single duel, no clean cinematic moment where one machine beat one tank and the war ended. That is not how Berlin fell. Berlin fell the way a building falls when you knock out enough of its supports. The ISU-152 knocked out the supports. It collapsed strongpoint after strongpoint until the prestige of an entire Waffen-SS division was nothing but scattered men hiding in rubble. On the night of the 1st of May, the survivors of Nordland tried to break out. Königsberg gave the order for anyone who could to slip out of the doomed centre and run for the west, for the river Elbe and the Americans. They broke from the Reich Chancellery and the bunker at 11 o'clock that night and pushed into the dark, small groups scattering through the ruins, trying to slip past the Soviet cordon. Most of them never made it. A few small groups reached the Elbe, but the majority were killed in the fighting or rounded up by Soviet troops in the days that followed. Königsberg himself got as far as the Berlin district of Dahlem, where he hid in an apartment for a week before he surrendered to the Red Army. The division that had been built to fight to the last had ended exactly that way, scattered and broken in the streets it had been ordered to hold. On the 2nd of May, 1945, the Berlin garrison laid down its arms. The city was silent for the first time in 12 days. And among the wreckage stood the squat, ugly, magnificent machines that had done so much to end it. Their gun barrels scorched, their hulls scarred, their crews exhausted and alive. So what does the beast killer leave behind when the smoke clears? The ISU-152 was never elegant. After the war, German analysts who studied captured examples were blunt about its flaws. They praised its heavy frontal armour and the devastating effect of its high-explosive shell, the way it could collapse bunkers and concrete and whole upper stories. But they were just as blunt about its weaknesses. It was slow to fire. Its cramped fighting compartment and poor ammunition stowage held its rate of fire down. Its traverse was painfully limited. It was nearly blind in close combat. It was awkward and vulnerable when it was forced to fight without infantry around it, and in an open tank duel against a German heavy tank, it was at a disadvantage. The German verdict was that you did not meet it head-on. You hit it from the flank at range. You suppressed it with artillery. You mined its approaches. You used anti-tank guns and close coordination. You did not trade shots with it. But that was never its job. Its job was to arrive with the assault, hit first, and break open whatever stood in the way. And at that job, nothing the Germans had could match it. The same analysts who criticized its faults also admitted what it could do. It could destroy by shock what an ordinary tank gun could not even scratch. It could turn a fortress into a graveyard. That was the thing the German reports kept circling back to. The weapon was not feared because it was elegant. It was feared because it could break open a defensive position and destroy by shock the things ordinary guns could not crack. That is the real reason the men of Nordland feared it, not because it was perfect. Because in the one place that mattered, the rubble of Berlin, where every street was a trap and every building was a bunker, the ISU-152 was the answer to a problem the Germans could not solve. They could pour all their courage, all their prestige, all their finest armour into holding a position. And then the Red Army would bring up the beast killer, point its hull at the wall, and the position would simply cease to be. The crews who drove those machines into Hitler's capital were not fighting for medals or glory. They were finishing a war that had nearly destroyed their country, a war that had killed tens of millions of their people. And they finished it the way they had fought the whole way from Stalingrad to Königsberg to Berlin. Step by step, block by block, shell by shell. The weapon they finished it with had been born at Kursk, hunting beasts in the open fields, and it died down its barrel in the ruins of the city where the whole war had been set loose. The German tank crews gave the machine its name out of fear. Zveroboy, the beast killer. But by the 2nd of May 1945, the beasts were the ones lying broken in the streets, and the men who had hunted them were standing in the ruins of the city where it had all begun. If you want to see how the Red Army cracked another fortress city wide open, the assault on Königsberg, where these same heavy guns smashed through concrete forts that were supposed to be impregnable, that story is waiting for you on screen right now. Go watch it.